Top 3 Scariest Beach Horror Stories That Will Scare You Stiff. Story 1. The Ocean's Call. You know that feeling when you're by the ocean and something feels off? That gut-wrenching unease that claws at your insides, pulling you deeper into something you can't understand? It happened to Ben and Lucy one night. They were on vacation, far from home, at a remote beach where the waves whispered to them from the darkness. They loved the idea of a quiet getaway, away from the chaos of everyday life. But this beach, there was something wrong about it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Ben noticed something strange in the distance. He couldn't make it out at first, just a shadow moving against the waves. But when the moonlight hit, he froze. It was a figure. A human shape, staggering slowly toward the shore. Lucy felt it too. The creeping sensation that something was lurking just outside their vision. But when they looked away, it was gone. They shrugged it off. Maybe it's a local, Lucy said, trying to laugh it off. But that night, Ben woke up to the sound of faint whispers. At first he thought it was just the wind, but as he lay there they grew louder. Words, indistinguishable at first, but then clear, almost melodic. Come closer. Come to the water. Lucy was asleep beside him, but Ben felt paralyzed, a cold sweat forming on his forehead. His body felt heavy, like it was being drawn toward something. The whispers echoed through the room, surrounding him, tightening around his chest. He tried to ignore it, but when the whispers became screams, he couldn't fight it anymore. He stumbled to the beach in a trance, drawn to the water's edge as if something had its fingers wrapped around his soul. The cold, black waves crashed violently at his feet, and the figure from earlier appeared once more, standing just beyond the surf. But it wasn't human anymore. Its eyes were hollow pits, empty and black. Its face was stretched, skin sagging like it had been underwater for years. The figure held out its hand, and before Ben could react, he was pulled into the sea. The water closed over him, and the whispers faded into a deep, suffocating silence. Lucy woke to find the beach empty. Ben was gone, swallowed by the very thing that had called him. And from that night onward, Lucy could feel the whispers, creeping into her mind, pulling her closer to the waves every time she closed her eyes. The ocean had claimed Ben, and now it was coming for her. Story 2. The Silent Swimmer. Samantha had always dreamed of visiting a quiet beach. When she found an isolated spot along the coast, she thought she'd struck gold, a peaceful paradise all to herself. But the ocean had other plans. She swam for hours, the warm sun above and the cool water below, until she noticed something strange. A man in the water, far off in the distance. He seemed to be swimming toward her, his strokes slow and deliberate. Samantha didn't think much of it. It was a beach after all. People swam. But as he drew closer, something about him didn't sit right. His eyes were wide open, but there was no expression. His face was pale, too pale, almost gray, and his movements were stiff, unnatural. She tried to swim away, but her body refused to obey. She was trapped in the water, the feeling of an invisible force pressing in on her chest, slowing her down. The man reached her, his cold hand grasping her ankle, his grip like iron. His mouth opened and he let out a low, gurgling sound. Not a word, just a noise that sent chills up her spine. She kicked, struggling, but the harder she fought, the deeper she sank. His hand tightened, pulling her under, and she could feel the ocean swallowing her, as if the water itself was alive. The last thing Samantha saw before everything went black were those eyes, those wide, empty eyes, staring at her from below the surface. When the lifeguard found her the next morning, she was floating in the shallows, eyes wide open, mouth agape. Her body was as cold as the ocean. And in the distance he saw the man again, still swimming, still watching. But this time there was no one left to save her. Story 3. The Beach That Never Ends. Laura and her friends went to the beach for a weekend getaway. It was meant to be fun. Some fun in the sun, a bonfire at night, and stories by the water. But the beach, this cursed stretch of sand, had plans of its own. The group found a secluded spot near the rocks, far from the crowds, and set up camp. As night fell, they lit a fire and gathered around. The air was warm, but there was a strange stillness to it. The sound of the waves had a hollow, distorted quality to it, as though the ocean itself was waiting. Laura didn't think much of it until she wandered off to take a walk along the shore. She turned to head back, but the firelight seemed further away than before. The path felt longer, and the sand beneath her feet felt different. The sky overhead was darker than it should have been, the stars distant and unreachable. She walked faster, but the distance only grew. The waves crashed, louder now, crashing against the shore with a force that made her heart race. Had she been walking for hours? It was when she looked behind her that she realized something terrible. The beach had changed. The trees, Those once towering, familiar figures in the distance were now twisted and crooked as though they had moved in the night. Panic set in. She ran, heart pounding, but the shore was endless. The sand stretched on forever, the fire nowhere to be seen. She turned around again, and the beach behind her looked different, more desolate, like a landscape from a nightmare. Laura never found her friends. No one did. The beach had become a prison, a maze with no way out. The ocean, once a soothing lullaby, was now a foreboding growl, and the land was alive. Lara's scream was swallowed by the waves, and her body never washed ashore. If you're still watching, you felt it, haven't you? That creeping unease? That sensation on the back of your neck as though something is lurking just out of sight? The ocean has heard your voice, and now it knows you. Don't think this story ends here. It never does. Subscribe or it'll find you next, because the waves are calling.